Put the Big Chungus song. Here's the Big Chungus song. Y'all ready? Ready for this? Here's a Big Chungus. It's a Big Chungus. It's a Big Chungus. It's a property song. It's a Big Chungus song. Yeah.
I don't know why you guys are still watching. I don't want to be watching.
Good morning, Quackhawks. Today we're going to talk about stories and how stories shape our identity and who we are. And this all ties into our idea of destiny that we're exploring this quarter. So this idea of how do the stories that you tell yourself about who you are shape what you're actually capable of doing. And in order to do that, we're going to finish Animal Farm. We're technically in chapter 10, but I'm using this as an opportunity to roll Animal Farm and our conversations about fascism into our conversations about destiny and how we change our destiny. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this whole idea that the CIA bought the rights to Animal Farm so that they could turn it into a cartoon movie, I've put a link to the end of Animal Farm, the cartoon, down in the description below. I want you to take a second to watch the ending of the movie and then compare that to chapter 10 of the book. Chapter 10 of the book very clearly shows this sort of thing developing. And it starts off with this very sad sort of recognition of people losing sight of their history, right? At the very beginning of Animal Farm, chapter 10, it says, "Years passed, the seasons came and went, the short animal lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion, except Clover, Benjamin, Moses the raven, and a number of the pigs." You'll notice in the cartoon movie, it has those exact same lines, except for it immediately cuts out before it says, "A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion." So that is very telling to how these edits to this story change the way that we viewed the story within the cartoon. So when we look at this in chapter 10, it is supposed to start with a recognition that we had forgotten our past, we had forgotten our roots, we had forgotten where things came from. So I ask you this, what do you think about the history of the United States? What do you think about the history that's brought us to this exact moment? As we look at ourselves isolated in the coronavirus, what do you know about the Spanish flu? When you look at people who are getting upset about the issues with race that are being faced in our world today, what do you know about the civil rights movement? What comes to mind and what are the stories that immediately rise to the top? When I say Spanish flu, I doubt that you thought of much of anything at all. And when you think of the consequences of the Spanish flu and how many people died, I wonder what it is that you immediately go to. When I say the civil rights movement, maybe you think of somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. Or maybe you think about Malcolm X. Maybe even further, you think about the bus riots or things that got shut down or the actions that were taken by civil rights leaders. Maybe you have a deeper understanding of this history. But you'll notice that when you have a limited view of the history of the civil rights movement, it paints a very distinct picture of what the civil rights movement was. When we look at something like just looking at the character of Martin Luther King through the lens of what popular culture tells us about him. This is an example of manufactured consent. The story that we tell about this person shapes the way that we view the entire movement of the civil rights movement. Notice how few stories we tell about the Spanish flu. I saw a really good post today about what the history books would say about the coronavirus. Would they paint it as this picture of this terrible thing that came over the entire world and that it shut everything down? Or 10 years from now, would that all just sort of go away? The stories we tell ourselves about our past shape our view of what we're capable of. Now, if you hadn't told yourself stories about the Spanish flu, you might not have realized just how bad these situations get. If you only share very specific stories about the civil rights movement, you might not hear about the violence, the protests. What do you know about slave rebellions and how successful or unsuccessful those things were? Those aspects of our history get lost because we are no longer aware of them. And as we look at this, we notice that that's absolutely how we start this chapter. we don't realize where animalism came from because we've grown out of animalism and we can't go back to our roots. Understanding who we are at our core helps us to better understand what we're capable of. You have to ask yourselves, what stories are you telling about who you are? Now, as this goes on, you'll watch the cartoon. And in the cartoon, everything comes to a head, and he invites a bunch of other pigs to come and have a delegate of pigs. And they all have a conversation as pig selves. And as the donkey is looking in through the window, he notices that the pigs look eerily similar to humans. And you're left with this conclusion. Wow, those pigs were no better than the terrible oppressors that they had before. But in reality, the way that George Orwell writes this story isn't about how they are are getting together with other pigs. And notice how that small shift in the narrative changes the way that we understand who the bad guys are. Who's the bad guy in the story of Animal Farm? Who do we resonate with? Are the bad guys all the pigs? Are the bad guys the pigs and the humans? And what are the humans supposed to represent? Now keep in mind that I've constantly said about Animal Farm, the humans representing other nations. When we say, look, the pigs were no different than the other nations, we have to then look at ourselves and critique the situations that we've put ourselves in. Our nation is no different from other nations. And therefore, when we look at the struggles that were experienced in the Soviet Union and why those struggles existed, we first have to look at ourselves and say, wow, how did the United States make those struggles worse? Maybe it's through these issues of trade and the acts of capitalism that made it more difficult. Well, the CIA doesn't want to tell that story. So instead, the CIA tells a story about how just the USSR, isolated in itself and with its own people that it supports, is this terrible organization. And what happens at the end of the movie? Well, of course, the animals rise up. They take control because you have the power to rise up against these evil Soviets, right? Well, that's a very different story than what we see George Orwell telling us. In fact, it's a story of defeat, a story of tragedy. As the animals look in through the window at the very end of chapter 10, it isn't one where they decide that they're going to rise up and take over. In fact, quite the opposite. They simply stare in through the window. But they had not gone any 20 yards when they stopped short. An uproar of voices was coming from the farmhouse. They rushed back and looked through the window again. Yes, a violent quarrel was in progress. There was shouting, bangings on the table, sharp, suspicious glances, furious denials. The source of the trouble appeared to be that Napoleon and Mr. Pinkleton had each played an ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. Notice how powerful the ending of that story is when we end it simply with, there is no difference. There's this act that happens when you read a book. You almost go through an act of grief or grieving when you're done with being within that story. And so you have this bit of sorry about that. You have this bit of introspection, this time where you think about the book and you wrestle with the book. If a book ends with a nice little happy ending, you might think, man, I wish that I could be a part of that happy ending. I wish that I could find love or romance, or that I could solve all of the world's problems or figure out the source of these crimes. But in reality, this story ends with, they were all the same. And that's a very powerful ending when you realize how powerless those animals were in defeating the systems that existed, and how those systems were no different from the systems that existed in countries that were labeling themselves as opposed to the Soviet Union. The problem here wasn't about the concepts of communism or socialism. It was about the issues of fascism and capitalism. Those two factors played hand in hand in creating a system where the average person was completely powerless. And they realized that using history and manipulating our stories allowed us to give up even more power to those systems. So I ask you guys this. As we start our next unit about destiny, what stories are you telling yourself? I'm going to take some time and I'm going to try and learn some new skills. For the next 5 weeks, I'm going to spend every Thursday learning a new skill and asking you guys to help teach me a new skill. I want to see what it's like when I throw away the story I tell myself. When I think to myself, who am I? I might say, I'm a teacher. Well, it's kind of weird being a teacher right now when I don't have a classroom and I don't traditionally have students. Well, then I might say, I'm a poet. I like to write poetry in my spare time, but it's kind of difficult to call myself a poet when I've never published a book of poetry. It's not like I'm making money off being a poet. Am I still a poet? What I definitely know is that I'm not a football player. There's no part of me that is a football player. I'm not very good at football. I don't like contact. I don't like the idea behind sports. It doesn't make sense to my feeble brain. So, what does it look like if I start telling myself a different story? I mean, I am 6'3". I'm a pretty hefty guy. I could probably play a little bit of football. What happens when I change the story I tell myself? Does it shift whether or not I feel powerless? Does it shift whether or not I take responsibility for my own actions? Changing the little bits of George Orwell's story changed everything about George Orwell's story. What can you change within your story to shift everything about how you see yourself? Is there something that you didn't think you could ever do? Well, now you have the chance to try. Is there something that you never thought you would ever be good at? This is your moment to really put in the effort and change things. I want to see you guys try to learn on your own. Learn something that you would never have thought to think about before. Learn something that you've never actually tried up until now. If you're going to start making meals, make the best meals that you possibly can. If you're going to do origami, make paper cranes, make 1,000 paper cranes. Spend this time doing something that you've never done before. Pick up skateboarding, pick up bike riding, pick up knitting, pick up sewing. All of these things might be ways that you can change the story you tell yourself, especially if that story starts with this thesis: I'm not good enough, and I can't do it. I think those stories are lies. And I think that it's time that we stop telling ourselves stories that are lies. With that being said, stomp your feet, clap your lap, yada yada, yell quack. Quack!